The throne room of the Vare dynasty had witnessed centuries of executions, but none quite like this one. Morella Thorne knelt in chains before the obsidian throne, her wrists raw from iron shackles that had been forged specifically to hold wolves who had forgotten their place in the natural order. Blood from the lash marks across her back had seeped through her torn shirt, staining the pristine marble floor with evidence of her defiance. Around her, the assembled court watched with the hungry anticipation of predators waiting for the kill. Nobles and advisors who had come to witness the end of an Omega, who had dared to challenge the crown itself. But Morella's amber eyes burned with unbroken fire as she stared directly at the man who held her life in his hands, refusing to lower her gaze despite every law of pack hierarchy that demanded submission from someone in her position. She had been beaten, chained, dragged through the streets like a common criminal, but she would not be broken. Not by pain, not by fear, and certainly not by the cold authority of the wolf who sat upon the throne like a god carved from shadow and steel. King Alaric Vare was everything the legends claimed and more. Tall, powerfully built, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light, and pale eyes that held depths of controlled violence that had built an empire from the bones of his enemies. At 35, he had ruled the Northern Territories for nearly a decade, transforming them from a collection of warring packs into the most feared kingdom on the continent. His authority was absolute, his word was law, and his justice was swift and merciless for those foolish enough to oppose him. Yet something flickered in those pale eyes as they studied the bloodied Omega kneeling before his throne, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were seeing her not as a criminal awaiting judgment, but as a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Morella Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that could command armies or silence storms. "You stand accused of inciting rebellion among the Omega population, of spreading seditious ideas about pack hierarchy, and of directly defying royal decree regarding submission protocols. How do you answer these charges?" The court held its collective breath, waiting for the standard response: pleas for mercy, protestations of innocence, or desperate attempts to shift blame onto others. What they heard instead was something unprecedented in the halls of royal justice. "I answer that your charges are accurate," Morella said, her voice clear despite the pain that must have been radiating from her wounds. "I did encourage other Omegas to question why their worth is determined by their willingness to submit to abuse. I did spread the dangerous idea that wolves are born with inherent dignity, regardless of their rank, and I absolutely defied your decree that Omegas should accept whatever treatment their betters choose to inflict." The gasps that rippled through the throne room were audible, shocked exclamations from nobles who had never heard such open defiance from someone in chains. But Morella wasn't finished. "Your Majesty asked how I answer your charges," she continued, meeting his pale gaze with steady determination. "But I have a question for you in return. What kind of king builds his power on the suffering of the powerless? What kind of strength requires the broken spirits of those who cannot fight back?" The silence that followed her words was so complete that the only sound was the soft drip of blood from her wrists onto the marble floor. Every wolf in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the explosion of royal fury that would surely follow such unprecedented insolence. Instead, King Alaric leaned forward in his throne, his pale eyes studying Morella with the intensity of someone encountering something entirely unexpected. "You believe I should rule differently? I believe you should remember that a kingdom built on fear and submission is a kingdom built on sand," she replied without hesitation. "Eventually the foundation crumbles, and everything comes down. And you see yourself as someone capable of bringing down my kingdom? I see myself as someone who refuses to pretend that cruelty is strength, that might makes right, or that being born Omega means I forfeit my right to be treated with basic dignity." Morella's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as if the proximity of death had freed her to speak truths she'd been holding inside for years. "You want to execute me for spreading dangerous ideas? Then execute me. But don't expect me to beg for mercy from someone who rules through the systematic brutalization of anyone too weak to fight back." The challenge hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Around them, the court watched with horrified fascination as an Omega. Nobody openly defied the most powerful wolf in the known world. This was the moment where royal justice would assert itself, where the natural order would be restored through swift and decisive action. But something had shifted in King Alaric's expression as he listened to her words, something that looked less like the cold fury of a ruler challenged, and more like the complex calculation of someone reassessing everything he thought he understood. "You present me with an interesting dilemma, Morella Thorne," he said finally, his voice carrying undertones that made several court members shift nervously. "Execution would make you a martyr for the cause you represent. Freedom would validate your defiance and encourage others to follow your example." He paused, his pale eyes never leaving hers. "Perhaps there is a third option." "Kill me or free me," Morella said, her voice carrying the flat finality of someone who had reached the end of hope. "Those are the only choices that matter. Everything else is just prolonged cruelty disguised as mercy." The words echoed through the throne room with prophetic weight, and King Alaric felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with the political calculations that usually guided his decisions. Looking at this bloodied, defiant Omega, who faced death with such unflinching courage, he realized that killing her would be like destroying something rare and irreplaceable. But freeing her would be tantamount to admitting that her accusations about his rule had merit, which left him with a choice that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could predict. "I choose neither," he said quietly, and the court erupted in confused murmurs as they tried to understand what unprecedented judgment their king was about to render. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The confusion that followed King Alaric's declaration rippled through the throne room like wildfire. Nobles exchanged bewildered glances, advisors whispered urgent consultations, and the assembled court waited with barely concealed tension for their king to explain a judgment that made no sense within the established framework of royal justice. Morella remained on her knees in chains, her amber eyes fixed on the pale gaze of the man who had just refused to grant either of her requests. The pain from her wounds was nothing compared to the confusion flooding her system as she tried to understand what neither could possibly mean in the context of life or death. "Your Majesty," Counselor Marcus Drain said carefully, his voice carrying the delicate tone of someone attempting to guide his sovereign away from a potentially disastrous decision. "Perhaps you could clarify the nature of the judgment you intend to render." King Alaric rose from his throne with fluid grace, his tall frame commanding attention from every person in the vast chamber. As he descended the steps toward where Morella knelt, she felt the weight of his presence pressing against her consciousness like a physical force. This close, she could see that his pale eyes held flecks of silver that seemed to shift like mercury, and his scent carried undertones of winter storms and something darker, something that spoke of power held in check by will alone. "The judgment is this," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the throne room despite its quiet delivery. "Morella Thorne will neither face execution nor be granted freedom. Instead, she will remain within the palace as my personal responsibility." The gasps that erupted from the assembled court were audible, shocked exclamations that bordered on scandal. Personal responsibility was a phrase that held specific meaning in pack law. It indicated property ownership of the most intimate kind, typically reserved for mates or blood family members. "Your Majesty," another advisor stepped forward, his face pale with what might have been panic. "Surely you don't mean to claim an Omega rebel as personal property. The political implications alone are my concern, not yours," King Alaric interrupted, his tone carrying enough edge to silence further protest. "The judgment has been rendered. It will be carried out immediately." Morella felt the blood drain from her face as the true scope of what he was proposing sank in. Not death, which would have been clean and final. Not freedom, which would have allowed her to continue her resistance elsewhere. Instead, a fate that was somehow worse than either, to be owned, utterly and completely, by the man whose authority she had dedicated her life to opposing. "No," she said, the word emerging with surprising force despite her weakened condition. "I refuse your judgment. Execute me or release me, but I will not accept being claimed as your personal plaything." "You refuse?" King Alaric's eyebrows rose slightly, as if her continued defiance amused rather than angered him. "I'm afraid that's not how royal judgment works, Morella. You don't get to accept or refuse the consequences of your choices." Then you're no better than the tyrants who came before you," she spat, struggling against her chains with renewed fury. "At least they had the honesty to kill their enemies outright instead of subjecting them to elaborate psychological torture. Is that what you think this is? Torture?" Something in his expression shifted, becoming more complex than simple royal authority. Perhaps you misunderstand the nature of what I'm offering you. I understand perfectly. You're claiming ownership of someone who defied you, turning my resistance into an object for your entertainment." Morella's voice carried bitter disappointment along with her anger. "I thought you were at least honest in your cruelty. Instead, you're just another predator who enjoys playing with his prey." The accusation seemed to strike something in him that her earlier defiance hadn't touched. King Alaric went very still, his pale eyes growing cold in a way that made several court members take involuntary steps backward. "Clear the throne room," he said quietly, his words carrying absolute authority despite their soft delivery. "Everyone out. Now." "Your Majesty," Councillor Drain protested. "Surely it would be unwise to remain alone with a dangerous criminal." "Out." The single word carried enough menace to send the entire court filing toward the exits with the speed of people fleeing an impending natural disaster. Within minutes, the vast throne room was empty, except for the king and the Omega who knelt in chains before him, blood still seeping slowly onto marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal judgment. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither seemed willing to acknowledge directly. "Stand," King Alaric said finally. "I prefer to remain kneeling," Morella replied, though her defiance carried less fire than before. The pain from her wounds was beginning to take its toll, and maintaining the energy for constant resistance was becoming more difficult with each passing moment. It wasn't a request, and my response wasn't negotiation. If you want me standing, you'll have to force me up yourself. To her surprise, he didn't respond with anger or threats. Instead, King Alaric moved closer and knelt beside her on the marble floor, bringing himself to her eye level for the first time since she'd been dragged into his presence. "Look at me," he said, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority he'd displayed before the court. "Really look at me, Morella." Despite every instinct that warned against giving him what he wanted, she found herself meeting his pale gaze directly. This close, she could see that his eyes held depths of exhaustion she hadn't noticed before, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had carried the weight of absolute authority for longer than anyone should be expected to bear. "What do you see?" he asked quietly. "I see a king who's grown tired of being challenged and has decided to break his enemies through possession rather than execution," she replied honestly. "I see someone who's confusing ownership with victory, and I see someone who's confusing mercy with cruelty." His voice dropped lower, becoming more personal despite the formal nature of their circumstances. "Morella, do you really believe that claiming you as my personal responsibility is about entertainment or psychological torture? What else could it be about? It could be about the fact that executing you would eliminate the only person in my kingdom brave enough to tell me the truth about how my rule affects those with the least power to protect themselves." His pale eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. "It could be about recognizing that your resistance comes from principles worth preserving, even if I can't allow those principles to destabilize everything I've built." The unexpected honesty in his response caught her off guard, making her reassess what she thought she understood about his motivations. "So you're claiming me as a pet philosopher? Someone to keep around for the novelty of honest conversation? I'm claiming you because killing you would be a waste of something rare and irreplaceable, and freeing you would be political suicide that could destabilize the entire kingdom." King Alaric rose to his feet, then extended his hand toward her. "But mostly, I'm claiming you because my wolf refuses to let you go." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession of something he hadn't intended to reveal. Morella stared up at him, trying to process the implications of what he'd just said, while her own wolf stirred restlessly at the mention of his. "Your wolf," she repeated slowly. "What does your wolf have to do with political judgment?" "Everything, apparently." His extended hand remained steady, waiting for her decision about whether to accept his assistance. "Tell me, Morella, what does your wolf think about being claimed by mine?" The question sent awareness flooding through her that she'd been trying to ignore since the moment he'd descended from his throne. Her wolf had been restless throughout the entire proceedings, not with fear or submission as would have been appropriate for an Omega facing an apex predator, but with something that felt disturbingly like recognition. "My wolf thinks your wolf is dangerous," she said carefully, though she suspected that wasn't the complete truth. "Dangerous how?" "The kind of dangerous that makes Omegas forget why they need to resist alpha authority." She looked at his extended hand, understanding that accepting his help would be tantamount to acknowledging his claim over her. The kind of dangerous that turns rebellion into submission without the rebel understanding how it happened. And you're afraid of becoming submissive. I'm afraid of losing myself to someone who sees my resistance as a challenge to be conquered rather than a position to be respected. Morella met his gaze directly, searching for signs of the predatory satisfaction that would confirm her worst fears about his motivations. Instead, she found something that looked almost like vulnerability. "What if I told you that your resistance isn't something I want to conquer?" he asked quietly. "What if I told you that your refusal to submit is exactly what makes you valuable to me?" I'd say that sounds like something a predator would say to convince his prey to stop fighting. Fair enough. King Alaric's slight smile held no mockery, only acknowledgement of her logical caution. But consider this. If I wanted a submissive Omega to abuse for my entertainment, I could have dozens of them delivered to the palace within hours. I don't need to claim a rebellious prisoner for that kind of gratification. The logic was sound, which somehow made the situation more unsettling rather than less. Then what do you need me for? I need you to remain exactly who you are. Someone who questions authority, who speaks truth to power, who refuses to accept that might makes right. His pale eyes held depth she was only beginning to understand. I need you to be the conscience I can't afford to have while making decisions that affect thousands of lives. And in exchange for serving as your personal conscience, I get to live as your property. You get to live as someone under my protection, with freedoms that extend far beyond anything most Omegas in this kingdom could imagine. King Alaric's voice grew more serious. But yes, technically, you would belong to me in ways that the law would recognize as ownership. The honesty of his response was almost worse than lies would have been, because it forced her to confront the reality of her situation without comfortable illusions. She could refuse his claim and insist on execution, dying as a martyr for principles that might inspire others to continue her resistance. She could accept his claim and live as a comfortable prisoner, able to speak truth to power, but ultimately powerless to change anything beyond the scope of her influence over one man. Neither option felt like victory. What guarantees do I have that this arrangement won't simply be elaborate psychological torture? She asked finally. You have my word as king, that harm will not come to you through my actions or by my command, he replied formally. You have my promise that your voice will be heard on matters of policy that affect Omega welfare throughout the kingdom. And you have my oath that your resistance to my authority will be protected as long as it serves the greater good of our people. Your word, your promise, and your oath, Morella repeated. All things that depend entirely on your good faith and could be revoked at any moment if your feelings about me change. Yes, all things that require you to trust someone whose authority you've spent your life opposing. His expression grew more complex. I'm not offering you guarantees, Morella. I'm offering you the opportunity to continue fighting for what you believe in from a position where that fight might actually accomplish something meaningful. The offer was both more and less than she'd expected. More in terms of potential influence, less in terms of personal autonomy. But as she knelt on marble floors stained with her own blood, facing a choice between death, imprisonment, or something unprecedented that defied easy categorization, Morella realized that refusing his claim might be the most selfish thing she could do. If he was sincere about wanting her resistance and her honesty, then her continued defiance from within the palace might accomplish more for Omega welfare than her martyrdom ever could. I have conditions, she said finally. I'm listening. I will not share your bed, regardless of whatever ownership rights you think you possess. I will not pretend to be grateful for this arrangement. And I will not moderate my opinions about your policies simply because expressing them might make you uncomfortable. Agreed to the first and third conditions. The second is unnecessary. I don't want your gratitude, Morella. I want your honesty. Slowly, reluctantly, she reached out and grasped his extended hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. The moment their skin made contact, she felt something electric pass between them. Not the simple awareness of touch, but something deeper that made her wolf purr with satisfaction she didn't want to acknowledge. Then you have your conscience, she said quietly. Whether that proves to be a gift or a curse remains to be seen. As King Alaric's fingers closed around hers with careful strength, as she felt the bonds of unprecedented ownership settling over her like chains made of silk and steel, Morella couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just agreed to something that would change both their lives in ways neither of them were prepared for. Because owning someone who refused to be broken was going to prove far more complicated than the Lycan king had anticipated, and being owned by someone whose wolf called to hers with dangerous recognition was going to test every principle she'd thought she understood about resistance and submission. The game between them was just beginning, and neither of them knew who would emerge victorious. The chambers assigned to Morella within the royal wing were more luxurious than anywhere she had ever lived, and that luxury felt like the most sophisticated form of psychological warfare she had ever encountered. The sitting room was furnished with pieces that looked handcrafted by masters. The bedroom contained a bed large enough for 6 people, and the private bath was equipped with amenities that spoke of wealth beyond anything an Omega from the outer territories could have imagined. But the most unsettling aspect of her new prison wasn't the opulence. It was the freedom. No chains bound her wrists, no guards stood outside her door, and no restrictions had been placed on her movement throughout the royal wing. She could come and go as she pleased, request whatever books or supplies she needed, and speak to anyone who crossed her path without fear of immediate punishment. It was everything she might have asked for if she'd been granted actual freedom, except for the inescapable knowledge that all of it existed at the pleasure of the man who now owned her. 3 days had passed since King Alaric had claimed her as his personal responsibility, and Morella was beginning to understand that the arrangement was far more complex than either simple ownership or elaborate torture. She hadn't seen the king since their conversation in the throne room, but his influence over her daily existence was unmistakable in ways both subtle and profound. Servants treated her with the kind of deference typically reserved for high-ranking nobility, addressing her as Lady Thorne, and inquiring about her comfort with genuine concern rather than the fearful obligation that marked interactions between staff and prisoners. Meals were brought to her chambers at regular intervals, featuring foods that were clearly chosen based on preferences she'd never expressed, but somehow perfectly matched her tastes. And when she'd requested books on political theory and Omega rights, they'd appeared within hours, volumes that should have been considered seditious material, but were delivered without comment or restriction. The message was clear. She was valued, protected, and provided for in ways that extended far beyond basic survival. But she was also, unmistakably, owned. The realization that her comfortable captivity was more unsettling than chains and dungeons would have been was forcing Morella to confront uncomfortable questions about her own psychology. Would she have preferred overt cruelty that would have made resistance straightforward? Was her growing sense of unease a reaction to genuine threat, or simply the discomfort of discovering that her captor was more complex than she'd wanted to believe? A soft knock at her door interrupted these spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the servants who had been attending to her needs with such careful consideration. Instead, King Alaric himself entered her chambers, and Morella felt that same electric awareness that had unsettled her during their conversation in the throne room. He was dressed more casually than she'd seen him before, simple dark clothing that somehow made him seem more approachable, while still radiating the controlled power that marked him as an apex predator. "Your Majesty," she said, rising from the chair where she'd been reading. "I wasn't expecting you. I thought it was time we discussed how this arrangement is going to work in practical terms." His pale eyes surveyed her chambers, with the assessing gaze of someone ensuring that his property was being properly maintained. "Are you finding the accommodations satisfactory?" "The accommodations are more than satisfactory. They're so satisfactory that I'm beginning to wonder what kind of price I'm going to be expected to pay for them." Morella set down her book, a treatise on Omega rights that should have been banned material, and faced him directly. "Because in my experience, kings don't provide luxury accommodations for prisoners without expecting something significant in return." "What makes you think I'm expecting something you haven't already agreed to provide?" "The fact that you're here, in my chambers, 3 days after claiming me as your personal responsibility. If this arrangement was truly about preserving my resistance for its own sake, you wouldn't need to check on me personally." King Alaric moved into her sitting room with the fluid grace that marked all powerful predators, settling into one of the chairs as if he belonged there. "Perhaps I'm here because I'm curious about how someone who spent her life fighting my authority is adjusting to living under my protection. I'm adjusting about as well as you'd expect someone to adjust to comfortable imprisonment." Morella remained standing, unwilling to settle into casual conversation that might normalize their unprecedented relationship. "Though I have to admit, the psychological complexity of benevolent captivity is more challenging than straightforward oppression would have been." "Challenging how?" "Straightforward oppression makes resistance simple. You fight against obvious cruelty. You maintain moral clarity about who represents good and evil, and you never have to question whether your captors might have redeeming qualities." She moved to the window, looking out over gardens that were beautiful enough to make her forget she was a prisoner. Benevolent captivity forces you to confront the possibility that your enemies might be more complex than you wanted to believe. And you prefer your enemies to be simple? I prefer my enemies to be enemies, not complicated people with motivations I might understand if I allowed myself to examine them too closely. Morella turned back to face him, surprised by the honesty that seemed to emerge whenever they spoke. It's much easier to maintain righteous anger when the target of that anger doesn't display unexpected depths of character. Unexpected depths, King Alaric repeated, his tone carrying something that might have been amusement. Is that what you call what you've observed about me? I call it a problem, because the version of you that I built my resistance around was a straightforward tyrant who ruled through fear and brutality. The version of you sitting in my chambers asking thoughtful questions about my psychological adjustment is... She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Is what? Is someone I might actually be able to respect under different circumstances. The admission emerged despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance. And that's a dangerous development for someone whose identity has been built around opposing your authority. King Alaric was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes studying her with the intensity of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. Tell me about your identity, Morella. Who were you before you became a symbol of Omega resistance? The question caught her off guard, with its personal nature. Why do you want to know? Because I'm trying to understand whether your rebellion comes from genuine principles or from personal grievances against the system that determined your social position. Does the distinction matter? It matters for determining whether your resistance is worth preserving or if it's simply displaced anger that could be redirected more constructively. His tone was matter of fact, but she could sense deeper currents beneath the surface of his inquiry. Morella was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much of herself she was willing to reveal to someone whose intentions she still couldn't fully trust. But if this arrangement was going to work, if she was going to be able to influence policy from within the palace, he needed to understand that her resistance came from principles rather than personal resentment. I was born to Omega parents in the outer territories, she said finally. My father was a scholar who taught me to read and think critically about social structures. My mother was a healer who showed me that strength could manifest as compassion rather than dominance. She moved away from the window, putting distance between herself and the king as she accessed memories that were still painful. They died when I was 16, killed in a raid by Alpha warriors who decided that Omega settlements were contributing insufficiently to territorial defense, a raid authorized by my father's administration. Yes, a raid that left me and dozens of other young Omegas orphaned and scattered throughout the kingdom. Morella's voice grew harder as she continued. I spent the next 6 years watching those orphans either break under systematic abuse or disappear entirely when their resistance proved inconvenient for their new masters. And that's when you decided to organize resistance efforts. That's when I decided that a system built on the assumption that Omega lives matter less than Alpha convenience was a system that deserved to be challenged. She met his gaze directly, seeing something in his expression that might have been understanding. My rebellion isn't about personal grievances, Your Majesty. It's about the principle that all wolves deserve dignity regardless of their rank. Even alpha wolves. Even kings who inherit systems they didn't create but are responsible for perpetuating. The question was asked quietly, but it carried weight that made Morella reassess what she thought she understood about his motivations for claiming her. I suppose that depends on whether those kings choose to perpetuate systems of oppression because they benefit from them, or whether they're genuinely trying to find ways to reform those systems without causing chaos that would harm the very people they're trying to protect, she replied carefully. And if I told you that I've been trying to find ways to improve Omega welfare without destabilizing the kingdom entirely? If I told you that your resistance, while admirable in its principles, has been counterproductive because it's convinced other alphas that any reform efforts represent weakness that could be exploited. Morella felt something shift in her understanding of the political landscape she'd been navigating. Are you saying that my rebellion has made things worse for the people I was trying to help? I'm saying that political change requires more than righteous anger and moral clarity. It requires strategic thinking, careful timing, and the ability to work within existing systems while gradually transforming them. King Alaric leaned forward in his chair, his intensity unmistakable. Your principles are sound, Morella, but your methods have been counterproductive. The accusation hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that her efforts to help her people might actually have been harming them. What would you have had me do instead? Accept systematic oppression? and hoped that those in power would eventually develop consciences? I would have had you work with reformers rather than against the entire system. I would have had you channel your passion for justice into policy development, rather than public demonstrations that convinced my advisors that Omega resistance represents an existential threat to pack stability. Work with reformers, she repeated, understanding beginning to dawn. Work with you. Work with me. Help me design reforms that improve Omega welfare while maintaining the political stability that prevents civil war. His pale eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. That's why I claimed you, Mirella. Not to break your spirit or possess you as a trophy, but to redirect your resistance into something constructive. The conversation was reshaping everything she thought she understood about her situation, about his motivations, and about the most effective ways to help the people she dedicated her life to protecting. But it was also revealing the scope of manipulation involved in his decision to claim her, emotional manipulation that was far more sophisticated than simple ownership or physical coercion. So this entire arrangement is about converting me from rebel to reformer, she said slowly, about convincing me that working within your system is more effective than fighting against it. This arrangement is about recognizing that we want the same things, Omega welfare and pack stability, but we've been approaching those goals from opposing directions. King Alaric rose from his chair, moving closer to where she stood. I'm not trying to convert you, Mirella. I'm trying to show you that your principles and mine aren't incompatible. And if I conclude that they are incompatible, if working within your system requires compromises I'm not willing to make, then you'll continue to be my conscience from whatever position allows you to maintain your integrity. His voice dropped, becoming more personal despite the political nature of their conversation. But I hope you'll at least consider the possibility that meaningful change might require collaboration rather than revolution. As King Alaric departed her chambers, leaving Mirella alone with thoughts that seemed to spiral faster with each passing moment, she realized that her comfortable captivity had evolved into something far more complex than either ownership or imprisonment. She was being courted, not romantically but intellectually and politically. The king was attempting to seduce her principles rather than her body, to win her cooperation through respect rather than fear. And the most unsettling aspect of this realization was that his arguments were logical, his goals seemed sincere, and her resistance was beginning to feel less like principled opposition and more like stubborn pride. If he was right about the ineffectiveness of her methods, if her rebellion had actually made things worse for the people she was trying to help, then maintaining her opposition for its own sake would be selfishness rather than principle. But if he was wrong, if his talk of reform was simply sophisticated manipulation designed to neutralize the most visible symbol of Omega resistance, then collaboration would be the ultimate betrayal of everything she'd fought for. The question was which interpretation was correct. And the only way to find out would be to allow herself to be drawn deeper into the dangerous game of palace politics, where the stakes were nothing less than the future of every Omega in the kingdom. 2 weeks into her residency within the royal wing, Mirella discovered that being the Lycan king's personal responsibility meant attending policy meetings where her input was not only welcomed, but actively solicited. The realization that her comfortable captivity had evolved into something resembling genuine political consultation was both thrilling and terrifying in ways she was still learning to navigate. The council chamber was a smaller, more intimate space than the throne room, designed for strategic planning rather than public displays of royal authority. Around a circular table carved from ancient oak sat the kingdom's most influential advisors, men and women whose decisions shaped the lives of millions throughout the northern territories. And at the head of that table, King Alaric presided with the same controlled authority that had built an empire from warring packs. The reports from the eastern territories are troubling, Councillor Marcus Drain was saying, gesturing to documents spread across the table's surface. Omega mortality rates have increased 15% over the past year, primarily due to workplace injuries in the mining operations. Injuries caused by what factors? King Alaric asked, though his pale eyes flicked briefly to where Mirella sat, as if gauging her reaction to information that directly affected the people she'd spent years trying to protect. Primarily overwork and inadequate safety protocols, Councillor Sarah Voss replied, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. The mine supervisors have been pushing increased production quotas without corresponding increases in safety measures. And the supervisors justify this approach how? They claim that Omegas are naturally more expendable than Alphas or Betas, So minor increases in casualty rates are acceptable if they result in improved productivity. Councillor Drain's expression suggested he found this reasoning as distasteful as it was pragmatic. The casual discussion of Omega expendability sent ice through Morella's system, but before she could respond with the fury such callousness deserved, King Alaric's voice cut through the council chamber with quiet authority. "Councillor Drain," he said, his tone carrying undertones that made several advisors shift nervously. "Did you just suggest to me that any of my subjects are expendable for the sake of improved mine productivity?" "Your Majesty, I was simply reporting the rationale provided by the supervisors whose policies have resulted in a 15% increase in preventable deaths among the most vulnerable members of our population." King Alaric's pale eyes had gone cold in a way that reminded everyone present exactly why other packs feared the Vare dynasty. "Tell me, Councillor Drain, what would you recommend as an appropriate response to supervisors who view my subjects as expendable?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Around the table, advisors who had been comfortable discussing Omega mortality statistics suddenly seemed to remember that their king's authority extended to all his subjects, regardless of rank. "I would recommend immediate review of safety protocols and disciplinary action for any supervisor found to be implementing policies that prioritize productivity over subject welfare," Councillor Drain said carefully. "An excellent recommendation. See that it's implemented immediately." King Alaric's attention shifted to the broader council. "I want safety inspectors in every mining operation within the month, and I want comprehensive reports on working conditions throughout the Eastern Territories." "Your Majesty," Councillor Voss interjected, "implementing such inspections will require significant resource allocation that might impact other territorial priorities. Then we'll reallocate resources from projects that don't involve preventing the deaths of my subjects." The king's tone brooked no argument. "Unless someone at this table believes that mine productivity is more important than the lives of the people who make that productivity possible." No one at the table was foolish enough to suggest such a thing, but Morella could see the discomfort in their expressions as they contemplated the financial implications of comprehensive safety reforms. She'd sat silent through the first part of this discussion, observing the dynamics of political decision-making from the inside for the first time in her life. Now she understood that this was the moment when her voice might actually matter. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, and every head at the table turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise and wariness. "If I may suggest an approach that might address both safety concerns and resource allocation issues, please. The increased casualty rates aren't just morally unacceptable, they're economically inefficient." Morella pulled several documents toward her, scanning data she'd been studying since gaining access to Kingdom records. Training replacement workers costs significantly more than maintaining existing ones. Lost productivity from deaths and injuries exceeds the short-term gains from pushing unsafe quotas, and worker unrest resulting from dangerous conditions creates security risks that require additional resources to manage. Continue. If we frame safety improvements as economic optimization rather than moral imperative, the mine supervisors will be more likely to implement them willingly. And if we tie supervisor compensation to long-term productivity metrics that include worker retention rates, they'll have personal incentives to maintain safe working conditions. The council chamber was silent for a moment as the assembled advisors processed her proposal. She'd just provided a framework for implementing the king's desired policy changes in ways that would minimize political resistance and maximize compliance, exactly the kind of strategic thinking that effective governance required. "An elegant solution," Councillor Voss said finally, her tone carrying grudging respect. "It addresses the immediate humanitarian concerns while providing practical implementation strategies." "More than elegant. It's effective," King Alaric said, his pale eyes meeting Morella's with something that looked like approval mixed with satisfaction. "Councillor Drain, I want you to work with Lady Thorne to develop comprehensive implementation plans based on her framework." The casual use of her title sent awareness through Morella that her position within the palace hierarchy had shifted in ways she was still learning to understand. She wasn't just the king's personal responsibility, she was becoming a recognized voice in policy development, someone whose opinions carried weight in decisions that affected thousands of lives. As the meeting continued, covering topics from trade negotiations to territorial security, Morella found herself contributing to discussions with increasing confidence. Her perspective as someone who had lived the consequences of royal policies provided insights that complemented the theoretical knowledge of career advisors, and King Alaric consistently solicited her input on matters affecting the kingdom's most vulnerable populations. But it was the conversation that occurred after the formal meeting ended that proved most revealing about the true nature of her relationship with the king. "Walk with me," he said, as the other advisors filed out of the council chamber. "I want to discuss your thoughts about the day's proceedings." They walked through corridors she was still learning to navigate, past windows that offered views of gardens, where the evening light created patterns of shadow and gold. The silence between them was comfortable rather than tense, the easy quiet of people who had found a working rhythm that didn't require constant conversation. "You handled yourself well in there," King Alaric said finally. "Better than most advisors do during their first months of council participation." "I've had years to think about these problems from the ground level," Morella replied. "It's not difficult to develop solutions when you've lived with the consequences of failed policies. That perspective is exactly what the council has been missing. Career advisors understand theory and precedent, but they've never experienced the human cost of the decisions they recommend." He stopped beside a window that looked out over the valley beyond the palace grounds. "Your contribution today will directly improve the lives of thousands of Omegas throughout the Eastern Territories. And you're telling me this because you want me to feel satisfaction about working within your system rather than against it. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that your influence extends far beyond symbolic resistance." King Alaric turned to face her, his pale eyes holding depths that seemed more complex each time she looked into them. "The rebellion you led accomplished nothing except convincing my advisors that Omega discontent represented a security threat. The policy recommendations you made today will prevent hundreds of preventable deaths." The comparison was stark and undeniable, forcing her to confront the reality that her years of resistance had been less effective than a single afternoon of collaboration. But accepting that reality meant acknowledging that he'd been right about the superiority of working within existing systems, rather than fighting against them. "You're remarkably skillful at making people want to agree with you," she said quietly. "Is that something you learned through formal diplomatic training, or is it a natural talent for manipulation?" "It's a survival skill developed through years of discovering that people respond better to respect than to coercion." His slight smile held no mockery, only acknowledgement of her logical wariness. "Though I suppose the distinction between influence and manipulation depends largely on the sincerity of the person wielding it." "And you consider yourself sincere?" "I consider myself someone who wants the same things you want, Omega welfare and pack stability, but who's learned that achieving those goals requires patience, strategy, and the ability to work with people whose motivations you might not entirely trust." King Alaric moved closer, close enough that she could catch his scent of winter storms and controlled power. "The question isn't whether I'm sincere, Morella. The question is whether you're willing to trust that my actions serve the greater good, even when you can't fully trust my motivations. And if I conclude that your actions serve your political interests more than the greater good, then you'll continue to be my conscience, pointing out the contradictions between my stated principles and my actual policies." His voice dropped, becoming more personal despite the political nature of their conversation. "But I hope you'll also continue to be my advisor, helping me find ways to bridge those contradictions constructively." The admission that he expected her to call out his hypocrisy while simultaneously helping him govern more effectively revealed the unprecedented nature of their relationship. She wasn't just owned property or political consultant. She was something between conscience and collaborator, someone whose resistance had been channeled into partnership without being eliminated entirely. "This arrangement we have," she said slowly, "it's not what either of us expected when you claimed me in the throne room, is it?" "No, it's not." King Alaric's expression grew more complex, revealing layers of uncertainty she hadn't seen before. "I expected to own someone whose principles I respected but whose resistance needed to be contained. Instead, I seem to have acquired a partner whose influence is reshaping how I approach governance, and I expected to be either broken or martyred for my beliefs. Instead, I'm discovering that effective advocacy might require compromising with people I'd rather oppose." Morella felt something shift between them. Not romantic attraction exactly, but recognition of compatibility that transcended their formal roles. The question is, whether this partnership serves our people better than the alternatives. There's only one way to find out. As they continued their walk through palace corridors that were becoming familiar rather than foreign, As she felt the weight of responsibility settling over her in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying, Morella realized that her identity was transforming as completely as her circumstances. She was no longer just a rebel fighting against systematic oppression. She was becoming someone with the power to influence that system from within, someone whose voice carried weight in decisions that shaped thousands of lives. The comfortable captivity had evolved into something unprecedented, a form of freedom that came with responsibilities she'd never imagined. Whether that transformation represented victory or defeat for her original principles remained to be seen. But as she caught King Alaric watching her with an expression that seemed equal parts respect and something deeper, she understood that the game between them had evolved far beyond simple ownership or resistance. They had become partners in something neither had planned, but both seemed determined to see through to its conclusion, whatever that might prove to be. And for the first time since her capture, Morella found herself genuinely curious about what that conclusion might look like. 1 year later, the Omega Welfare Commission convened in what had once been a storage room in the palace's lower levels, transformed into a meeting space that deliberately eschewed the intimidating grandeur of traditional royal chambers. Instead of thrones and formal seating arrangements that reinforced hierarchy, the room contained a simple round table, surrounded by chairs that placed every participant at equal height and distance from the center of discussion. Morella stood at the head of that table, reviewing documents that represented a year's worth of policy reforms that had reshaped the relationship between the crown and the kingdom's most vulnerable population. The commission itself was unprecedented, a formal advisory body with actual legislative power, composed of Omegas from throughout the territory who met monthly to evaluate existing policies and propose new protections for their communities. The mining safety protocols have reduced workplace fatalities by 63%, she reported to the assembled commissioners, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to wield influence effectively. Eastern Territory mortality rates are now lower than they've been in over a decade. And the resistance from mine supervisors? Asked Commissioner Elena Marsh, a former seamstress who had become one of the most effective advocates for Omega labor rights. Minimal, once they realized that safe working conditions actually improve long-term productivity and reduce training costs for replacement workers. Morella's smile held satisfaction that had nothing to do with political maneuvering and everything to do with lives saved through careful policy implementation. Turns out that framing reforms in economic terms rather than moral imperatives makes them much easier to accept. What about the education initiatives? Commissioner James Rivers had been a field worker before his appointment to the commission, and his questions consistently focused on practical implementation rather than theoretical ideals. 47 Omega children have been admitted to advanced schooling programs that were previously restricted to Alpha and Beta families, Morella replied, pulling out another set of documents. Graduation rates are exceeding expectations, and several graduates have already been accepted into professional apprenticeship programs. The statistics represented more than bureaucratic success. They represented individual lives transformed, families lifted out of systematic poverty, communities gaining access to opportunities that had been denied for generations. Each number had a name, a story, a future that was now possible because someone had chosen collaboration over pure resistance. And the king continues to support these initiatives? The question came from Commissioner Sarah Voss, the oldest member of their group and the most skeptical about the sustainability of their reforms. The king continues to support initiatives that demonstrably improve pack welfare while maintaining political stability, Morella replied carefully, which, fortunately, describes most of what we've accomplished over the past year. What she didn't mention was the private conversations that had shaped those public policies, the late-night discussions in royal chambers where policy details were negotiated through debates that had evolved far beyond formal advisor relationships. She didn't mention the way King Alaric listened to her opinions with the intensity of someone whose decisions had been fundamentally changed by her perspective, or the way her own understanding of effective leadership had been shaped by watching him balance competing interests without compromising core principles. She definitely didn't mention the way their intellectual partnership had gradually acquired emotional dimensions that neither of them had planned or initially acknowledged. "There's something else we need to discuss," she said, her tone shifting to address matters that would affect the Commission's future operations. His Majesty has proposed expanding our legislative authority to include oversight of beta worker conditions as well as Omega welfare. The proposal generated immediate discussion, with commissioners debating whether expanded authority would increase their effectiveness or dilute their focus on specifically Omega concerns. But beneath the practical considerations was a more fundamental question that everyone present understood. Was the Omega Welfare Commission evolving into something broader, more influential, more integrated into the kingdom's power structure than anyone had originally envisioned? Expansion could provide us with more resources and broader political support, Commissioner Marsh observed, but it could also make us targets for the kind of political opposition we've managed to avoid by focusing specifically on Omega issues. The king wouldn't propose expansion unless he believed we could handle the increased responsibility, Commissioner Rivers said thoughtfully. And broader authority might allow us to address systemic issues that affect all lower-ranking PAC members, not just Omegas. The question, Commissioner Voss said quietly, is whether we trust this king enough to accept increased integration into his power structure, or whether maintaining our independence is more important than expanding our influence. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Morella felt the weight of leadership in ways that were both familiar and constantly surprising. A year ago, she'd been someone whose resistance was based on absolute opposition to royal authority. Now she was someone whose effectiveness depended on working within that authority, while maintaining enough independence to provide genuine oversight. I trust his commitment to the reforms we've achieved, she said finally. But more importantly, I trust our ability to withdraw support if that commitment wavers. We're not powerless anymore. We're partners in governance, which means we have leverage to protect our interests. As the meeting concluded, and commissioners prepared to return to their home territories, carrying news of successful reforms and proposed expansions back to their communities, Morella found herself alone in the chamber that had become the center of her new life. A soft knock at the door interrupted her review of documents for the next day's Royal Council meeting. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the palace staff who had become accustomed to working with the commission. Instead, King Alaric entered the chamber, his presence transforming the modest space through sheer force of personality. But where his appearances had once made her tense with wariness, now she felt something that was part professional anticipation and part personal warmth. "How did the commission meeting proceed?" he asked, settling into one of the chairs around the table with the easy informality that had developed between them over months of collaboration. "Successfully. Your proposal for expanded oversight authority generated significant discussion, but the consensus was positive." Morella gathered her documents into neat stacks, a habit that helped her organize her thoughts as much as her paperwork. Though several commissioners expressed concerns about increased political exposure, reasonable concerns, broader authority brings broader opposition, King Alaric's pale eyes held the thoughtful intensity that appeared whenever he was considering complex political calculations. "Are you confident the commission can handle the additional pressure?" "I'm confident that we can handle anything that doesn't require us to compromise our core principles." She met his gaze directly, seeing her own certainty reflected in his expression, which is really another way of asking whether you're confident that expanded authority won't require us to moderate our advocacy for policies you find politically inconvenient. After a year of working with you, Morella, I think I've learned that your advocacy becomes more effective when you have more resources to support it, not when you have fewer. His slight smile held warmth that had become increasingly familiar. Besides, politically inconvenient policies that improve PAC welfare have turned out to be excellent long-term political investments. Enlightened self-interest disguised as moral leadership? Moral leadership supported by enlightened self-interest. The distinction matters less than the results. As they discussed implementation strategies and potential challenges, as their conversation shifted seamlessly between policy details and philosophical implications, Morella reflected on how completely her life had transformed since the day she'd knelt in chains before his throne demanding death or freedom. She'd received neither, and discovered that the alternative was something she'd never imagined possible: genuine partnership with someone whose power was absolute, but whose authority was now tempered by her influence. She was no longer just owned property or political consultant, but someone whose voice shaped the future of the kingdom in ways that served the people she'd dedicated her life to protecting. "There's something I need to tell you," King Alaric said as their meeting drew to a close. "Something about the nature of this arrangement we've developed." Morella felt her pulse quicken, uncertain whether he was about to announce changes that would affect her political role or their personal relationship. What kind of something? The kind that involves acknowledging that neither of us expected our professional partnership to evolve into whatever this has become. "Bogkin," His pale eyes met hers with vulnerability she'd rarely seen from someone whose position demanded constant strength. "I claimed you as my personal responsibility because my wolf refused to let you go. But I've discovered that my human consciousness refuses to let you go for entirely different reasons, which are that you've become the most important person in my life, professionally and personally. You've changed how I think about leadership, about responsibility, about the kind of king I want to be." His voice dropped lower, becoming more intimate despite the formal setting. "And I've realized that owning you was never what I actually wanted. What I wanted was to earn your respect, your partnership, my what?" she asked softly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Your love, if you're capable of loving someone whose authority you spent years opposing." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Morella felt something shift in her understanding of what their partnership had become. She'd been so focused on political collaboration that she'd failed to recognize the emotional bonds that had developed alongside their professional relationship. "I've been in love with you for months," she said quietly, surprising herself with the ease of the confession. "I just didn't know how to reconcile loving someone I'd been taught to see as my enemy. And now I understand that enemies can become partners, and partners can become something much more significant than either bargained for." She rose from her chair, moving to stand before him with confidence that came from finally understanding her own heart. "I love you, Alaric, not as my king or my captor, but as the man who chose to value my resistance rather than break it." When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who had been holding back desire for longer than was sustainable. But it was also tender, reverent, the kiss of someone who understood that what they were claiming was more precious than political authority or personal freedom. "Marry me," he said against her lips, "not because I own you, but because I want to spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside you as an equal partner." "Yes," she replied without hesitation, understanding that marriage between them would be unlike any royal union in the kingdom's history, a partnership of true equals who had chosen each other despite every reason they should have remained enemies. As news of the engagement spread throughout the palace and beyond, as plans began for a wedding that would symbolize the possibility of transformation rather than the perpetuation of traditional hierarchy, Morella realized that her journey from rebellious prisoner to queen had been the most unexpected of revolutions. She had demanded death or freedom and received neither. Instead, she had discovered that love could be more powerful than resistance, that partnership could be more effective than rebellion, and that the most profound changes sometimes required working within systems rather than destroying them. The girl who had knelt in chains demanding execution had become a woman who would rule beside the man who had once owned her, and that transformation felt like the most complete victory she could have imagined. Because she had changed everything: the kingdom, the king, and most importantly, herself. Not through martyrdom or escape, but through the patient work of building something better, from the foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. The revolution was complete, and it looked nothing like what anyone had expected. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.